A lovely day to you. This is Let's Talk on Loveworld Plus, and it's great to have you join us today. My name is Zoe Okafor, and today we are looking at the crisis in northern Mali and Nigeria's involvement in its resolution. Now, Nigeria is strategic in the economy of the West African sub-region. Apart from population, the country boasts of huge potential that surpasses those of many other the other 15 countries that make up ECOWAS. So the country could be said to dominate most of the transnational trade in the region. However, the dominance of Nigeria in such trade is facing an increasing threat owing to security challenges in the region. The latest being the onslaught of Islamist groups in northern Mali. Now, we want to look today at Nigeria's involvement in the resolution of that particular crisis. What exactly is Nigeria doing? At what cost is it coming to the country? What are the threats really that are being posed by the crisis that is going on within Mali? These are some of the things that we are going to be looking at in today's discussion. And to help me do that, I am joined by Chinedu Chiddy. He is the coordinator of the Book Rain Initiative. He is the winner of the Betas reality show season 2. He also is a political analyst. You're welcome to
Always a great pleasure to be here.
Great. So we're talking about the crisis in northern Mali. Now, before we go into Nigeria's involvement in the resolution of that crisis, I want us to have a little backgrounding. Now, Mali has been considered to be a somewhat stable country, and then all of a sudden we heard about a coup d'etat in that country. Let's have a little history about how the crisis in northern Mali, how it all, a little history as to how that started, backgrounding really.
Well, I think you're correct in stating that overall, relatively, Mali has had quite a stable democracy. And up until, of course, recently, when we had the ouster of the democratically elected president of Mali. And I think just a little summarized background to this crisis, you have to look at the northern region of Mali, which is about the largest region in Mali. And then you have to, which is popularly simply referred to as the Manzard region, and it is dominated largely by the Tuaregs. And you have to look at the agitation of the Tuaregs over time. I think there's been greater agitation for self-determination, or greater agitation for autonomy, self-determination, the desire to have greater independence from the entire Malian geographical circles, if you like. And so greater agitation for that, the ouster of the president, the desire to grab power, to possibly secede, and all of that. But then you have to look at the interference in that particular struggle by the what we like to refer to as the liberation forces of the Manzard region, by the Tuareg-dominated Ansar-Din movement, which is a largely Islamist group. And of course, when they were fighting against the official Malian forces, they were somewhat united because they had a common enemy. But when the president was ousted from office, the Islamist agenda of the Ansar-Din movement, which is largely Tuareg-dominated to like the entire Manzard region, had a dominant Islamic goal to Islamize the entire country, which was different from the struggle initiated by the liberation forces of the Manzard peoples, which was to wrest power to a large extent and then to seek greater autonomy and possibly self-determination. So the mission of the Ansar-Din movement, which is a largely Islamist group, is to Islamize the entire state of Mali and to impose Sharia law. So I think that that's the difference between the Ansar-Din movement and the movement by the movement of the liberation of forces of the Manzard peoples. So that's the background to it. So right now you have a dominant force which is anti-stability, anti-democracy in Mali, which is largely Islamic, with an Islamic agenda led by the Ansar-Din movement.
Okay, now talking about Nigeria's involvement in, tackling the crisis within northern Mali, we've had Nigeria, of course, coming up with troops. We have like 700 troops on standby. Nigeria seems to be at the forefront of the military intervention into Mali. Now, I want us to look at the threat. What threat? Let's try and describe the threat that the Islamists within northern Mali really pose not just to Nigeria, but to West Africa as a whole. I mean, we've seen them actually impose Sharia on northern Mali. We've seen a lot of destruction of some, UNESCO heritage sites at Timbuktu and all of that. Apart from that, what other threats does this crisis really pose to the whole of Africa?
I'll look at this particular issue. I'll look at Nigeria's involvement from 3 different perspectives. Number one, you have to look at Nigeria's strategic place in Africa and in the West African sub-region. Nigeria is more or less the economic and population powerhouse of the West African sub-region. So Nigeria has a responsibility to maintain order, a responsibility to ensure that there is a process, an unfettered process of democratic development in Western Africa. Nigeria's place in ECOWAS is actually crucial, is strategic, and it's prominent. So Nigeria has an incredible responsibility to ensure that this sub-region is moving in the right direction. So that's the first perspective. That's why Nigeria's involvement is critical. That's why Nigeria's involvement is justified. That's why Nigeria has to be seen to be participating fully in the resolution of this conflict. So first, it has to do with Nigeria's responsibility because of a strategic role and a strategic placement in the West African sub-region. Secondly, you have to look at Nigeria's interest in northern Mali, or Nigeria's interest in Mali as a whole. Now, part of our foreign policy, of course, is to try as much as possible, which is also part of the ECOWAS broad geographical vision, to create a borderless West Africa and to ensure that there is a free trade exchange between countries in West Africa. So you have to understand that Nigeria would have economic interest in Mali as with other West African countries, and with the increasing belief and increasing strategic attempt at creating a collective economic future for West Africa. You have to understand that our economic future is integrated and that we are trying to build structures where countries would harness resources, and try as much as possible to promote free trade and to ensure that there is development collectively of the West African sub-region. So that's the second thing, Nigeria's economic interest in West Africa, which is tied to the collective ECOWAS vision for West Africa as a whole. And the third, you have to look at this crisis from a strategic point of view. You have to understand that this is in northern Mali. It is Muslim dominated. And you have to also understand the fluidity, if you like, or the porosity of borders in West Africa. That you have to look at northern Nigeria and look at the Boko Haram crisis, and then understand that they also have quite a similar agenda with the Tuareg rebels in the Ansarudin movement, which is largely to Islamize. From the snippets of intelligence reports that we have, we understand that what Boko Haram is doing is related to what the Ansarudin movement is doing in northern Mali. So I think it is in our best interest as much as possible to try to forestall the influence and the reach of the Ansarudin movement in order to prevent a possible spillover into other regions in West Africa. We experience in ours in the northern part of Nigeria. And I think that the earlier we cut off their influence and cut off their powers, will possibly limit their support to terrorist or Islamist groups that are related to them in agenda and in approach.
Okay, so if that is not tackled, it could become like a base. Of course.
Intelligence reports have established a connection between the Ansarudin movement, their Islamist agenda, and Al-Qaeda. So it's more or less established that this is a terrorist group, and they have the capacity to extend their influence to different regions in Africa where they have groups that are willing to embrace their ideology and groups that are actually working in tandem with their agenda to Islamize through force.
Okay, well, if you're just joining us, this is Let's Talk, and we are looking, we are analyzing actually Nigeria's involvement in the northern Mali crisis. I'm still talking with Chinedu Chiddy, who is the coordinator of the Book Rain Initiative. He's also a political analyst. Now, I'm just thinking, now apart from the fact that you said that Nigeria has a responsibility to be seen, to be in the forefront in tackling this crisis because of her positioning within ECOWAS and within Africa as a whole. Don't you think that it's sort of a burden on the country, considering the other issues that are going on within the country? Of course, there's still the Boko Haram issue. Don't you think that it's like an extra burden? And although, yes, she has to, Nigeria has to do this because responsibility demands that she does it. Do you see it being a burden that would may overwhelm the country. What do you think about,
I'm actually familiar with the criticism that Nigeria is a sort of approval. It's sort of an approval monger, seeking attention in the international community in spite of the mounting challenges within Nigeria's borders, demanding effective government intervention. But much as I understand the criticism, and I think there is some credit to it, but I think it is a bit too far-fetched. I understand that we have a collective responsibility, you know, an integrated, I would like to refer to it as an integrated responsibility, integrated in the sense that you have domestic issues to tackle, you have foreign issues to tackle. You have to look at our country's capacity, you have to look at our structure, you have to look at our size, and then you would understand, even with our access to resources, that we actually have the capacity to address both our internal challenges and our external challenges. There is no point splitting, you know, in time span, what to do today for domestic issues and then to forget about foreign issues and say, okay, we'll leave it at a later time in the future until all our internal problems are resolved. There will not be a time when all our internal issues, all our domestic challenges would be resolved by government. The external issues, like I established earlier, are quite connected to our internal issues. I told you of the connection between the Boko Haram in ideology and possibly in approach and in strategy. And it is likely that if the problem in northern Mali, security issue in northern Mali is not resolved as soon as possible, it could have an impact on groups that are related in ideology like the Boko Haram group if there isn't already established connection between these groups. So I think that we have to understand that our country has the capacity to address both the internal issues and the external issues. We cannot shy away from our international responsibility because we have internal challenges. But I think it is incumbent on the government to realize that it is about time that they took full hold of the internal issues in the country, given our enormous capacity to handle it. We have the capacity, but are we actually exploiting that capacity to resolve the issues that we have at home and abroad? I don't think so. That's why the criticism has some credit. So I think it is incumbent on the government. I think it's about time that the government realized that you have to focus on internal issues as well as foreign issues and ensure that you achieve substantial success in managing internal issues and managing external issues. And don't forget that we contributed about 600 of the over 3,000, you know, security personnel that will be in Mali, and about 5 other West African countries are also contributing. And then if you look at it, about 600 security personnel, given the thousands of security personnel we have, I don't think it's too much to us, given the strategic place of northern Mali and the security risks it poses, not just to Nigeria, but to the whole of the West African sub-region.
Okay, let's take a look at, you know, the cost implication, as it were. At what cost does this military intervention come, you know, from Nigeria's point of view? And also, is there anything to gain from this? Now, apart from the fact, of course, that we would be forestalling some, you know, whatever that might be happening in that region, and it's seeing it spillover rather into the country. Is there anything else that we stand to gain from being at the forefront of this military intervention? We've been in Liberia, and apart from the fact that, of course, we were part of establishing some level of peace and stability in that country, is that really all that we stand to gain from doing that? Is there something else? What's the cost?
I would focus first on the strategic and economic implication of our involvement before I focus on the humanitarian, if you like, implication of our involvement. Like I said earlier, that we are strategically positioned in Africa, and in West Africa in this case, to actually intervene. It is in our best interest, given our status, given our strategic placement, and also given our interest in the West African sub-region. We have, so to speak, a common destiny. We have an integrated path to development. We have a collective path to evolving. And I think that to not intervene and to not participate in ensuring that we create stability in the West African sub-region will be a disservice to us, also be counterproductive, so to speak. So like I've established earlier, we have to understand that we have an important position, and that important position must be used to secure our interest. So our foreign interest, which is both economic and political, and also in establishing our influence and our hold as the superpower, if you like, of the West African sub-region. These things are critical. Also, there is a possible connection, if not checked, between the Tuareg rebels in Ansarudin movement in northern Mali and the northern part of Nigeria, because we're experiencing a similar threat, from inside our borders. And don't also forget that we have a case of porous borders in West Africa, and there are northern regions around, or northern Islamic regions around Nigeria's northern region, from Chad, from Niger, from Mali, that could have a possible inflow, if you like, into Nigeria's northern region and exacerbate the crisis that we're facing. But beyond all of these strategic reasons, economic reasons, and all, I would like to also establish the fact that as children of a common humanity, we must realize that we have a conscience-laden responsibility to ensure that not only our safety, but the safety of other human beings within our region and across the world. Every time we have an opportunity and a capacity to provide assistance to other human beings who are suffering, we have a responsibility to do that. I think it is part of our call to responsible humanity. It is part of our call to higher humanity, and I think that every government and every people must support that we must collectively walk a higher path. And that higher path ensures that no people must consider themselves in isolation from other people. We must understand that we are interdependent and we have a common destiny.
Okay. Now, I want us to look at Mali, the government in Mali itself. Remember, it was because of the coup, and because of the confusion and the chaos. It was as a result of that the rebels were able to take advantage of that and then make the incursion into northern Mali. Now, how is that being tackled? Are the coup plotters, how well are they collaborating with ECOWAS and with other African Union, like the AU, for instance, in tackling that aspect as well? We know the interim president hasn't had it easy. I mean, he got beat up at some point, he came back, and a lot of things are happening. How is that particular issue being addressed while still looking at tackling the rebel issue in northern Mali?
Well, I think that to get a clearer picture of this issue, you have to understand that after the coup, the Islamists had an upper hand in the country. They wielded the greater influence. They had greater control over the country, especially the northern part of the country, which is about the largest and most strategic part of the country. So I think the single biggest challenge in Mali is tackling the extensive reach and influence and power of the Islamist group. And that's what ECOWAS is focusing on. Of course, not ignoring diplomacy and other approaches to resolving the power vacuum in strict sense in the country and restoring Mali to a democratic path. So I think that the security situation in Mali is actually critical to re-establishing the democratic process. So you have to understand that the Tuareg-dominated Ansarudin movement and other affiliated Islamic groups have a rather stranglehold on the country's development at the moment and on the country's return to a democratic process. They hold sway and they're trying as much as possible. They're striving, exploiting their powers and their resources and their reach to Islamize the country and push the agenda at the expense of the collective will of the people and, of course, of democratic interest in Mali. So I think that the security situation is actually tied to the possibility of restoring democracy in Mali. So I think it's an integrated issue, and I believe that the ECOWAS are working seriously to ensure that they bring interested parties to the table as well as resolve the security challenges. And don't forget that if you've tagged the group a terrorist group, and they're actually a terrorist group, it means that you can't sit with them on the table normally.
Yes,
and you have to understand that it has to be via security power that ECOWAS would have been able to overpower them and ensure that they comply with acceptable standards of international behavior.
Okay, so that's like the main issue, keeping the country from even having elections. We've seen elections in Sierra Leone, for instance. Now, what is the future really for Mali? How soon do you see this crisis being resolved? Are we looking at you know, in the nearest future, this issue being tackled? Are we seeing a prolonged, you know, war or maybe conflict within northern Mali and all of that? You know, from your position where you stand, if you were to project, how do you see this whole thing play out, and how soon?
Well, as best as anyone would try to project, to prognosticate, or to predict based on given facts and, you know, statistics and what is actually occurring on ground. I think it is very difficult to actually establish the trajectory and its end. But I think there's something that is critical, is that interested parties must realize that they have the capacity to determine the timeline of this particular conflict, and they must work assiduously to ensure that this happens. And I think that it is crucial that external powers like the United States, and of course the UN has expressed concern, and AU, of course, which is outside the Western Africa sub-region, but of course is the overall international body of Africa, would understand that they have an incredible responsibility to ensure that Mali is restored to the peaceful process and a democratic process. So I think that is crucial. The United States has actually recognized the fact that Ansarudin poses a very serious threat to security and constitutes a dependable ally to Al-Qaeda. So I think that they understand that they are a group that is strategically positioned to cause disruption and derailment from the democratic process. So I believe that they will consider that important to intervene as the need would arise and dictate to them.
Okay, well, in closing, how do you suggest we tackle this problem of insurgency, especially Islamic-based insurgency? You know, is military intervention the only plausible solution to tackling that particular challenge? And I'm talking about, you know, the whole of Africa here. What do you suggest that happens?
Well, I think extremist groups, whether Islamic or non-Islamic, whether social or non-social in strict sense, would always exist. But I think that what we have to do is to try as much as we can to proactively deconstruct the system in such a way that we remove the atmosphere under which they will be easily bred, and they will easily survive, and they will easily perpetrate their dark practices. I would like to say, and I've always said this, that no matter how much a society develops or evolves, you would always have people who will submit to the dark impulses of the human nature and choose to resort to force to perpetrate their destructive goals and agenda. But I believe that it is possible to a large extent to maintain a substantial level of peace by creating an atmosphere that is healthy, an atmosphere that favors constructive engagement. And I think that that is something that is quite lacking in different parts of Africa. There are certain peoples who are isolated and kept away from the center, if you like, of democratic engagement or civil engagement. And I think that we must promote an open society, and a society that encourages extreme integration of peoples, a society that favors the integration of different peoples, and that provides opportunity for ventilation of ideas, even dissent. And we must try to promote constructive engagement. It is only via constructive engagement, long-term constructive engagement, that we can diffuse tension and ensure that different views are heard, different ideas, different ideologies are brought to the table, and then we forge a common front and ensure that peace thrives above all else.
Okay, and do you think that's the same that should go for tackling insurgency in Nigeria, talking about Boko Haram, the same?
Yes, of course. I don't think that brute force can permanently eliminate insurgency. I believe that there has to be engagement. I believe that we have to create an atmosphere that favors interaction, an atmosphere that favors constructive engagement, an atmosphere that favors civil integration. So I believe that in the long run, we have to realize that brute force cannot eliminate dissent, brute force cannot eliminate extremism, and we have to realize what creates the atmosphere for fostering extremism and for fostering what do you call a wrong absorption of negative ideology. Education is crucial, and education not just in our own terms, not by dictating to people what to learn, but by creating an open space and letting people vent their frustration, bring different ideas to the table, diverse approaches to development, by constructive engagement of different ideologies, different people, different views. I believe we are going to be able to forge a union that is forward-looking and that is on the path of stability and peace and progress.
Okay, thank you very much. On the path towards stability and progress, my guest has talked about engagement and about proper civil integration as a solution to tackling insurgency of any kind. And while Nigeria remains at the forefront of trying to resolve the crisis in northern Mali, we do hope that that particular challenge will be resolved as quickly as possible. We have been analyzing Nigeria's involvement in the northern Mali crisis at the moment, and I had been talking with Chinedu Chiddy, who is the coordinator of the Book Rain Initiative. He also is the winner of the reality show The Debaters Season 2, and he is also a political analyst. Thank you so much for coming today.
Always a great pleasure.
Throwing more light on this issue. And thank you very much as well for being part of today's edition of the program Let's Talk. Let's do this again. Do not forget to check out our news website. You can have more news updates on that website. Plus, you can put your comments as well as your contributions right there.